We walk the footsteps of our fathers, the trails blazed by our mothers. They bought the land with their blood long ago, long ago. Oh, sing, sing for Manether, and oh, weep, weep for the blood of Aemon. Oh, cry, cry for Manether, and long ago, long ago. So, episode 3 then. This episode has a lot in it that I have a lot of thoughts about. This was very, very unexpected in some ways. Some very, very unexpected things happen in this episode. But also some very questionable things. There's a lot I love about this episode, and a lot I'm really concerned about. So to get it out of the way, I'm going to start with the thing I'm most negative about this episode. And that's everything with Perrin and Egwene. Well, that's not fair. I like their first scene where Perrin's trying to start a fire and Egwene's like doing her channeling. I like that scene because Perrin almost goes into this like manic fugue state trying to start the fire, cutting his finger. That's my phone. And you can tell that it's because he's essentially like projecting onto Egwene his like protective instincts. He's trying to in his head somehow like make up for what he's done by trying to help someone else or whatever. And I like that scene. But everything after that was kind of weird. So first of all, the absence of Elias is a problem. And I don't say that just because I like the character, which I do. I think Elias is a very important character. It's important to have someone actually explain the whole wolf thing to Perrin. But, by the way, I kind of forgot to say the warning at the start of this. This has book spoilers in it. I'm talking as someone who's read the books about the books. But the absence of Elias also has the secondary issue of not having him there to introduce the Tuathan. And that means that the scene with the Tuathan is really weird and awkward. I don't feel like they properly explain what the Tuathan are, and what they do explain somehow makes it seem like a more stereotypical depiction of essentially Romani people than what we get in the books. I actually rather appreciate the Tuathan for being one of the rare cases of like fantasy Romani that doesn't feel particularly offensive, because all the negative stereotypes about them are considered stereotypes within the world as well. Like, the narrative condemns people who have all these stereotypes about them. The show doesn't go into that, and they also do the weird thing where it seems like Perrin and Egwene have never heard of them before, which is an odd choice. The Tuathan in the books are very much something that everyone is aware of. Everyone has bias against them. And I think the Tuathan really only work as a group that exists in a world that hates them for no goddamn reason. Like, completely unjustifiably. I think that's a very important aspect of that group, and I think something is lost if you make it so that apparently no one in the Two Rivers is aware that they exist. But also, I feel like the scene where Aram, like, sort of, like disrespectfully almost towards his grandparents, explains the whole song greeting thing to Egwene and Perrin. Uh, I feel like that's just a weaker scene than the scene in the book that it's adapting, where it's Elias who is with them and who knows the proper answer to the question. And we learn about the Tuathan through, and sort of naturally, through Elias's interactions with them. So their absence here, his absence here rather, I think really messes up all the scenes with the Tuathan. And that's really all that happens in this episode with those two characters. Like, Egwene and Perrin don't really have a ton going for them in this episode. I've seen some people online talking about how, ooh, there's now like romantic tension between Perrin and Egwene. Is Perrin already forgetting about his wife? No. That's directly adapted from the books. There's weird romantic tension between Perrin and Egwene here in the books as well. And I don't actually think it was intentional on Jordan's part, because it never comes up again. It's just like these couple of chapters, there's this weird tension, and then it's never brought up again. So I guess they kept that in an attempt to make the interactions true to the books. Personally, I enjoyed it because I didn't feel that tension, but that might be because I already know nothing comes of it. Okay, moving on. Nynaeve. So, first things first, I really, really, really like her whole sequence with fighting the Trollocs, like the flashback that's the cold open to the episode. I enjoyed that. I think that was actually great. I think Nynaeve is the sort of character who would, like, in this moment, her insane murder rage would activate, and she would just kill this superhuman entity with basically her bare hands. I think that was actually a very cool scene. It didn't make her feel like overpowered, because she didn't overpower it. She outsmarted it, which isn't that hard to do with a Trolloc. And then immediately afterwards, we cut back to the present and the interaction with Lan. And, okay, so the decision to have Nynaeve actually try to kill Lan, to, like, have her call his bluff, I cannot remember if anything similar happens in the books, I'm gonna be honest, but it felt a bit off to me in the moment. Like, my first instinct was Nynaeve would never do that, because Nynaeve is a healer. Nynaeve would not kill a human being. Like, she tries to avoid it. Like, later on in the series, she doesn't even want to kill a Forsaken. Like killing people is not her thing. That being said, though, the more I think about it, the more I actually like it. And the reason is, it is actually in character. Because Nynaeve would never kill a person when thinking clearly. But Nynaeve has absurd anger issues. Like, she is pissed off at this moment, and she is not fully in control of her actions. And I think as the series goes on, looking back on this scene, that it's going to become apparent that that's what happened here, that Nynaeve, in her lucid state, probably would never have tried to stab Lan through the throat. And we see that nurturing side of her later on, where even though she doesn't trust Moiraine or Lan, she never once tries to get out of helping Moiraine. She never tries to sabotage Moraine's healing, because she is first and foremost a healer, and even if she hates these people right now, she is going to heal them. So I actually like everything with Nynaeve here, and I'm also glad that we're introducing Liandrin early. Both because I feel like the Red Aja needs to be made a credible threat um, as soon as possible and explained. Um, and because hopefully the introduction of Leandrin will help alleviate the racial issue that I talked about at the end of the previous video, where both of the where like all the villains so far are black, which isn't great. So hopefully Leandrin helps to sort of even that out a little bit, and further on maybe Elida as well. But that's neither here nor there. I also really like the actress who plays Leandrin. She's nothing like what I imagined Leandrin in the books. I pictured Leandrin very differently, much sort of much more young and girlish, I guess, like sort of like a spoiled brat is how I always pictured her because of her personality. But they're going for a more cold and calculating Leandrin, and that's fine. I don't mind that. Leandrin is not a particularly deep character, so I don't mind changes to her personality. The introduction of Logain didn't actually happen this episode. I mean, he just showed up at the end with some really cool, creepy music. I love that, and the transition into the credits. But I can't really talk about Logain because nothing really happened. So that'll have to wait for next episode, which should be primarily about Logain, because it's called The Dragon Reborn, and it's way too early for the actual Dragon Reborn to be relevant, so it's gotta be about him. And that just leaves us with the third subplot here, which is Rand and Matt. Now, Rand and Matt have a... this is an interesting decision, because what we have in this episode is a series of events that, like, technically none of this is in the books. Like, the entirety of Rand and Matt's plot in this episode is, like, made up out of whole cloth for the show, but it's an amalgamation and a synthesis into a new plot of elements of a bunch of different things that happen to Rand and Matt over the course of the first book. So this was like 5 or 6 chapters worth of stuff, very, in my opinion, expertly condensed into a single episode's plotline. It gets the point across. It replaces the whole time in the books where they're going from inn to inn to inn. Even though I really like that part of the book, and controversially, it's one of my favorite parts of not just that book, but the Wheel of Time in general. I just really like Matt and Rand's journey to Camelin. I think that for a show, that repetitiveness, if they'd gone like 4 episodes of the same thing happening over and over again, that would have been boring. So I'm glad they did this. I'm making some assumptions here. I'm making the assumptions that we won't have 3 more episodes of the same thing happening, but I think that's a safe assumption. I would assume that we are still going to get at least one more encounter with Dark Friends, specifically the one in 4 Kings, I believe the village was called, which is where Rand does the lightning. That seems like an important moment that you shouldn't really skip when adapting the first book. So I'm hoping that next episode or the episode after that, we do get that particular scene. Now, the other interesting stuff going on here in this episode. So we've got 3 elements to talk about. Well, 4 actually. Let's start with the one that's carried over straight from the books, which is Matt and Rand's relationship. And Matt is clearly worsening from the dagger. You can tell because he's completely changed his tune from the last episode. Until the last episode, in the last episode, he was the one who was constantly telling Rand, no, we gotta keep going. Like, what? Just go with it. Why do you keep complaining and wanting to go home? And now, mysteriously, after getting that dagger from Shadar Logoth, Mat has started complaining and wanting to go home and bugging Rand about it. So that I think that was very, very well done, because I think it's subtle. I think new viewers who don't know what's happening might not pick up on that, and they're going to think that Matt is just acting out of character, which might be bad short term, because they're gonna be like, the show's bad, it's written badly. But if they stick with it, hopefully once the dagger thing is revealed in a couple of episodes, presumably, people will be able to look back on this episode and be like, that was clever. That was a subtle, clever way to hint at that. So that's all I have to say about Matt's performance here. I did like that what's her name, Dana, the Dark Friend. I actually like that she assumed that Matt and Rand were a couple, because, well, let's just say that the first book of the Wheel of Time has some definitely unintentional, but also definitely present subtext in that direction. Not a lot of people pick up on it, but as a queer guy reading the first book of the Wheel of Time, I was absolutely like, oh, this is like a shipping gold mine, Rand and Matt. So I'm glad that the show acknowledges that. And I also really appreciate Rand's response, because basically through Rand's response, it's kind of established that homosexuality is not a big deal in this setting. Like, Rand doesn't respond with shock or disgust or horror or like, oh my god, no. No, he's like, oh, trust me, if I wanted a man, I could do better than Matt Cawthon. Which I think was a great response. I liked that. It was a nice little hint that that maybe homophobia isn't a thing in the Wheel of Time in this version. It's also kind of not a thing in the books. The books are also weird about that. It's not really clear, because all the gay characters get introduced by Sanderson, so it's not clear if Jordan ever had any intentions to do that. But all the male gay characters, I mean, the whole Aes Sedai thing, which is kind of weird and fetishistic in the books, that's Jordan. But speaking of which, we also get, I think, a hint that the show might be going for a Moiraine Swan romance. Because Moiraine, in her, like, delirious, half-dead state, actually mutters Swan's name and, like, slightly smiles when she says it, which was very cute, and I'm hoping it's a hint that that those two are going to be a couple. They do technically both have other romantic pairings in the book, but I don't think either of those are good or compelling in any way. So I am more than happy if they decide to cut that and just leave Moiraine and Swan as a couple in this show. I don't know if they're doing that, but I hope they are. Because that's a much more compelling relationship than either of them ever have with their significant others in the book. Speaking of their significant others, Tom Marilyn is introduced in this episode. So this is going to sound mean, because it's not the actor's fault and it's not the director's fault. It's just how the actor physically is, I don't like his voice. His singing voice, I mean. I somehow, I just, that doesn't sound right for Tom Maryland to me. I'm sure it'll grow on me, but for this episode, like the whole time he was singing, which was a very nice song, and also some like subtle world building and backstory about Luz Theron, but the whole time he was the whole time he was singing, uh, I was basically making this face because the voice just rubbed me the wrong way. But like I said, that's my personal issue, not an objective criticism, and I'm sure I'll get over it. Um, I don't love Tom stealing from Matt. That feels a bit out of character. And in general, Tom feels a bit more edgy, cynical than he should be. And a part of that is also the changes to his appearance. I really wish they'd kept the Gleeman's cloak. I mean, it's there, but I wish they'd kept it in the more like extravagant version where the patchwork is on the outside. And I wish they'd kept his mustache. Switching to a guitar was a good idea, though. I always sort of pictured Tom with something like a lute, so basically a guitar in the books, even though that's never said on the page, and in fact it's explicitly said he has a harp. My brain just kind of edited out the harp and replaced it with the lute because that just made more sense for the character to me. So I am perfectly happy with that particular change. The Aiel is interesting. I was actually beginning to wonder if they were even going to do the whole Rand isn't from the Two Rivers storyline, because they skipped the main reason that anyone knows that in episode 1. But no, they seem to be going there, because they did zoom in on the Aiel's red hair and have Tom say like, oh, only the Aiel have hair this color, no one else in the world. So clearly that's still going to be a thing. But there's something weird going on with that. So, okay, I'm going to start sounding like a crazy person now with this theory. But hear me out. A small part of me thinks that there might be a chance that the show is going to make Nynaeve the dragon. Which would be a very bad idea. And I hope they don't do it, and I don't think they're doing it. But here's why I think there's like a small chance that they're doing it. So, first of all, they gave Nynaeve the explicit backstory that she isn't from the Two Rivers. Secondly, she never confirmed her age to Moraine. She said that she went through the water braiding ritual 6 years ago, I believe, or 5 years ago, and Moraine then extrapolated that that means that she's 26. Nynaeve didn't confirm that in any way. She didn't need to. It's kind of obvious, but it could be a hint. And thirdly, here's the weird part. All of the marketing for this show talked about there being 5 candidates for the dragon. The Amazon website description for episode 1 talks about 5 candidates for the dragon. But Moraine only talks about 4, and she also says that there are 4 ta'veren in the 5 rivers? What? No, 2 rivers. So, right in episode 1, Moraine seems fairly convinced that it's not Nynaeve. Like, she's eliminated Nynaeve very quickly, and she says, one of the four of you. But then in this episode, we get Dana. And Dana says of the dream given to her by the Dark One himself, who presumably knows what he's talking about. She says, one of the five of you is the dragon. So, Moraine has eliminated Nynaeve, but the Dark One has not. And also, Nynaeve is the only one who's been explicitly established to not be from the Two Rivers, and also there's some vagueness and inconsistency about her age. Again, I don't necessarily think they're doing it, and I hope they're not, because, by the way, I don't think changing who the dragon is necessarily a good idea. I think it's a pretty bad idea, actually. But if you're going to do it, Egwene is the only possible candidate. Like, it would be baffling to do anything else if you're going to change the dragon. Like either you stick with the dragon as he is, or you make it Egwene. No other options are acceptable. So I will not be happy if it's Nynaeve. And it wouldn't work, I think, at all, narratively. So I'm hoping they're not doing that. But if they're not doing that, what are they doing? Why is all this weirdness around Nynaeve happening? I think it might be a red herring. Maybe they're trying to throw us off the trail, like, by sort of weirdly implying that it might be Nynaeve constantly, so that when it isn't, everyone is surprised. I hope that's the case, and that'll be fine. I'll be fine with that. Just wanted to get that out there, that I do have that weird suspicion that I'm hoping isn't true. What else do I have to talk about this episode? Right, the final thing about this episode that I have to talk about is the scene where Dana suddenly says, "Oh, the braid was too much, wasn't it? Made me look too much like her." First of all, that is an amazingly chilling way to reveal that. I got shivers the instant it happened. But secondly, I assumed something much more serious was happening. Like, in hindsight, obviously she's just a dark friend who received visions from the Dark One. But in my head, I paused the video as soon as she said that, and immediately saw a much cooler, more interesting way for that particular scene to go. And hear me out here. Early Lanfear introduction. Would that not have been an incredible way to reveal Lanfear? I'm glad it's not. It's too early for Lanfear. That's definitely not a season 1 kind of character you want to introduce this early. But it would have been cool. And I'm kind of sad they wasted that line here, because it would have been cool for Lanfear. But okay. But I do like Dana. She's an interesting character. And even more interestingly, she seems to imply at the end that the Dark One wants to destroy the world. Like, he wants to... Like, she says break the wheel, but the way she's talking about it, it doesn't sound like he just wants to stop things from repeating. He wants to just stop the world from existing. Which is different from his goals in the book. And if that's true, that'll be a good change, because I prefer that to the Dark One's goals in the book. Because in the book, the Dark One just wants to rule the world and make it evil, which is a bit of a one-dimensional thing for him to want. Like, they gave the more interesting motivation to Moradin in the book, and I Okay, I'm going to make a separate video at some point where I'm just going to talk about my issues with the Dark One's ideology and why I think the Dark One's choice of Nameless makes no sense and someone else should have been Nameless. We'll talk about that later. I have a lot of thoughts about that. But suffice it to say, I like that. I like the idea of trying to build more nuance for the Dark One instead of just making him be what he sounds like. The Dark One, the big bad. I hope they keep going down that route because if there's one thing that's aged worse than the Wheel of Time's uh, messed up gender politics, it's the whole Dark Lord thing. It's become very cliche, and no one takes it seriously. So I'm hoping that they just add a little smidgen of nuance to the Dark One in this, maybe. Okay, that's all I have to say about this episode. I'm really looking forward to the next one because that's the one where we're probably gonna get a ton of low gain, and that's gonna be all new and surprising stuff that I'm very much looking forward to. See you next time.